On this solemnity of our Lord Jesus Christ, King of the universe, we hear from Matthew's Gospel, one of the most famous Gospel passages that comes to us out of the 25th chapter. Sometimes we call it the parable of the sheep and the goats, but it's really not a parable. It's not about the allegory of sheep and goats or the simile of that. Instead, it really is apocalyptic literature, eschatological literature, and that genre from Jesus himself that is revealing to us. Right? It is apocalyptic revelation. So it is meant to be somewhat descriptive, not just an allegory for insight, but a way in which we are to understand the coming of the Son of Man, the second coming, right? The day of judgment, if you will. And in the story, we hear very clearly that there will be a separation of sheep and goats, right? And in that separation, we would recognize in the rest of Matthew's gospel this dichotomy, or this really paradigm of how Jesus approaches his eschatology, the end times, that there is a responsibility that we have to responding to Jesus' message, whether we accept or reject his message, that then at some point in the future has a judgment day, whether we've done so or not. And we have seen in other categories within Matthew's gospel that sometimes that is between wheat and weeds, right? That there's two things here. Or it's between wise virgins and foolish virgins who are prepared for the bridegroom's coming. Or who uses their talents or buries their talents, right? We hear over and over again this idea that there is a personal responsibility we have in response, and we will be held account for, to the love of God that's shown to us in Jesus Christ. We also hear an idea of a very important value in Jesus' culture at the time, which was the value of honor, whether you were honorable or dishonorable. And so the coming of the Son of Man is surrounded in honor. It's meant to set up Jesus as the most honorable. So he comes in glory. He comes with all of his angels. He comes and sits upon his glorious throne, and all the nations of the world come before him. In every one of those steps, it's solidifying his honor as the coming of the Son of Man. But I bet that all the nations of the world that are gathered around the coming of the Son of Man, if we can imagine that scene, they are probably surprised by a couple of things. The first thing that I think they're surprised about is that the king upon his throne is not a military leader, is not a political leader, isn't a financial tycoon or a media mogul, that the person who sits upon the throne is a shepherd, that he's a shepherd that has come to serve, that he's come to guide, that he's come to heal, that he's a good shepherd who has laid down his life for his sheep. And so the normal power dynamics of what our expectation of judgment in the end of the world would be are not what God provides. What God provides is a kingdom of love, of justice, of peace, a kingdom where his mercy is made present to us, where the power of God is expressed most fully in his forgiveness and his mercy towards us. Many of you know that my journey towards priesthood was very windy, and there were lots of critical decision points and events along that journey. And one of them, and I've shared this before, but one of those moments was when I finally got enough courage to see if I could follow where God would lead and leave the Air Force 2 years early from my 5-year commitment to go to seminary. And so I had no idea for sure if that would be the case or not. I didn't know if the Air Force would approve that, but I thought it would be worth seeing if God would open that door. And so I learned that, and as a lesson from a friend of mine at the Air Force Academy whose name was Todd Zumbiel. And so he was trying to pray and discern if God was calling him to be a certain leadership position, the 4th Group Commander. And he kept praying about it, and he wasn't getting a clear answer. And so this is helpful whenever we're trying to follow God, because he said eventually he applied and he was selected as the 4th Group Commander. But he said, I figured if I was standing still, God could point me in any direction that he wanted, but if I wasn't moving, I would never get there. But if I'm moving and I'm offering everything to God, even if I might take a wrong turn here or there, he will eventually lead me to the destination that he wants me to get to. So I was trying to apply to get out of the Air Force and go into seminary to study for the priesthood. And I went to the personnel office. And I asked for the paperwork, and they said no. They said no one in your career field is being allowed out of the Air Force early for any reason. It'll be a waste of our time. And at the time, I had not reached the level of holiness you see before you today. And so I went back a week later, and I flirted a little bit with the ladies. And I used my dimples, and I got the paperwork. And so I went through the process of trying to fill out that paperwork, and there's a lot more to the story, but it had to go all the way up the chain of the command to the Secretary of the Air Force for approval. And each of those steps, the first step, my immediate commander of my flight, he was a major, but he was Lutheran, and he was getting ready to get out of the Air Force to become a Lutheran minister. And he and I prayed together every morning before work. So that was no problem. And everyone else in the chain of command, I didn't know this till afterwards, everyone else in the chain of command was Catholic. So it started going up through the approval process till it got to the base commander. And the base commander wanted to have a conversation about it. So he called me to his office, and I went in. He said, come with me. We got into an old government K car, and we drove out to the runway. I was at Whiteman Air Force Base working with the B-2 bombers. And he drove out to the runway, and we parked about 50 yards from the runway and sat on the hood of the car and had a nice conversation as B-2 bombers were doing touch and goes. So the plane comes in for a landing, touches its rear wheels, throws it into afterburner, and takes back off again. It is awesome. At 50 yards from the runway, it is awesome. It still gets my heart racing, and I get excited about seeing flybys or planes going in afterburner with the roar of the engines. Everybody say awesome. So that was the environment. And we had a nice conversation about all the different directions and everything, and eventually he asked me this question. He said, you know, you are a very promising and talented first lieutenant in the United States Air Force. You are working on the newest weapon system in the Air Force inventory that has the capability of projecting power globally. You serve in the most powerful Air Force in the world, and you are part of the greatest country of the world. Are you sure you want to give all that up? I wasn't following to priesthood for power, but for service. Following the Good Shepherd, laying down my life for the sheep. So I affirmed to him that that's what I was wanting to do, what was in my heart. And he supported it and sent it on up the chain of command. The rest is kind of history. But the king that comes in glory and comes in power is a shepherd for us. One who heals, one who binds up, one who forgives, one who offers to us life, who pastures us, as we heard in the first reading, right? It is God who is our good shepherd. And our paradigms of what power is and how the world works need to be readjusted in terms of how God comes as the King of the universe. The second thing that I think they were probably surprised about when they saw the king there was what the criteria was for judgment. Right? We hear it 4 times in today's gospel reading, right? It's how we treat the least of these. Those who are thirsty, those who are hungry, those who are strangers, those who are naked, those who are ill, and those who are imprisoned. How do we treat them? In fact, what it becomes is our response to the message of the good news of Jesus Christ, our response to God's love for all of humanity and for us personally, is lived out in how we treat the least and the lowly, of how we respond to others. And there is plenty of room within that to have a discussion about how we do that as a community or as a city or as a state or a country, how we do that structurally. But there is an important piece of it that is within each of our hearts. How do we look upon each of our brothers and sisters with compassion and love? How do we see the dignity of each of them? How do we respond to them? And I'm not prescribing that you have to be like me. That's probably best. But long ago, I kind of came to a resolution that whenever I encounter a homeless person on the street and they ask me for money, if I have money in my wallet, I give what I have, right? And so this had happened one time, and I also interact and engage and introduce and ask the name and something of their story, because often what they're really hungering or thirsting for is recognition, that they're not invisible. And so I was there, and I was coming out of the cathedral, I think after an ordination or something, and I'm on the front sidewalk in front of the cathedral, and this man and woman come up to me, and so we introduced, we get to talking, and they were homeless, but as we got to talking, of course, it came around to the point where they asked me for money, and I said, well, if I have any cash, I don't think I've got anything in my wallet, but I'll check, and if I've got anything, I'll give you some, right? I'll give you something. And so I pulled it out, and I had forgotten that I'd had a wedding with a very generous stipend of a $100 bill that was in my wallet. And I opened up my wallet and I saw the $100 bill and I went, no. I said, it's your lucky day. Here you go. To see others with love and compassion and dignity and to serve those who are in need is the criteria of the final judgment in today's gospel. It's how our hearts have responded to the love that's been shown to us. And then I think the third thing that would surprise them is that Jesus takes that very personally. I mean, he identifies with the poor, with the thirsty, the hungry, with the stranger, with the naked, with the ill, with the imprisoned, right? Jesus identifies himself with them, or them with himself. They are, in a sense, the authorized representatives of the King, right? They come to us bearing the gospel message. They are the ones who call us out of ourselves to be able to love as Jesus has loved. We need them in our lives in order to grow our own hearts in the image of Christ. So they are messengers of the King. They are his authorized representatives. Many of you know that for 12 years I served as the vicar for priests. I was also, when I first was named vicar for priests, I was also the vocation director. And a vicar is someone who represents someone else, right? So the Pope is known as the vicar for Christ. So he's the representative of Christ on earth. I was the vicar for priests, so I was the Archbishop's representative for his priests. So that was my role. And as vocation director, my associate and I were going to go to Lexington to see a vocation conference they were putting on. We kind of wanted to do it low-key, to kind of just observe how did they organize it, what were the topics they were covering, how did they kind of have the schedule laid out and all that. And then we thought, we'll go, and then we don't have to stay the whole day, right? We can just kind of sneak out the back if we need to, but we want to kind of get an experience of this. So we went, and we went to sign in for the conference, and as soon as they saw my name, they're like, oh, Father Schooner, we're so glad you're here. You'll be seated with the bishop at the front table. When we have Mass at the end of the day, when we have Mass, you can celebrate with the bishop, and you will give out communion with him, invest with him. They weren't treating me so much for being incognito or sneaking out, right? But they weren't treating me because of who I was that way, but because I represented the Archbishop, right? They were treating me as if I were the Archbishop of Louisville. We treat the poor as if they are Christ. We look at them and interact with them and talk with them as if they are Christ, because Christ himself has identified with them. He has called them himself. When we give and serve and generously offer our support and walk and encounter and accompany them, we are accompanying Christ. When we come to this Eucharist, we encounter Christ as well. And we get the foretaste of heaven here in our midst, and it calls us outside of ourselves into what God has promised, right? He journeys with us and nourishes us and gives us the capacity to move forward. We also know that there's a day of response, and that comes with accountability. None of us should be surprised when the King comes in his glory that he is a good shepherd, that the criteria is how we have treated others, especially the least, and that he himself has been the one we have served when we treat others with love.